Hello friends, this is Caly. Thanks so much for joining me today for a faux watercolor technique. I actually learned this technique from Dawn from W+9 on her Encourage Creativity community on Facebook. So I thought I would kind of recreate that and kind of put my own spin on it and share with you using the joyful poinsettia background stamp that she created, as well as the bells and bow set. I have some distress watercolor cardstock here that I'm placing inside my MISTI. I do use a MISTI mouse pad, so there's a slick surface, so I can use any kind of tape runner I want to hold down my cardstock. So that's what I put down, is the Simon Says Stamp dot tape runner. It'll hold my cardstock in place while I stamp this background, which is an A2 sized background. So I have my cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And now we're gonna start inking this up with some Distress Oxide inks. I've got some Scattered Straw Distress Oxide ink here in the yellow, and I will be using a finger dauber to apply all of my ink today. And because this technique takes a while to ink the entire floral image, you want to use an ink that can be reactivated with water. So Distress inks are great for this, or Distress Oxide inks are great for this. Alright, so once I'm done with the yellow, I'm going to go in with Festive Berries and cover all of the poinsettia petals or leaves. Going over those flower centers now and just adding a little bit of a darker shade using Fired Brick. And then for the foliage or the leaves of the little berries, we're going to be using some pine needles. I am just adding in the color where those leaves are, and it's okay if they overlap with the red a little bit because we're doing a faux watercolor technique and it's going to all blend together nicely. Last but not least, we're going over the pine cones with some walnut stain Distress Oxide ink. At this point, I've covered the entire stamp, so now I'm going to use my distress sprayer and just spritz some heavy mist over the entire stamp. This is going to really wet that ink and activate it, and then allow us to get that watercolor impression. And if there are any globs of water, like I see here on this one pine cone, I'm going to pick up the excess fluid with a cloth. And if you like, you can also impress it a second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth time, depending on the amount of water and how loosely you like that watercolor look. I'm just doing 2 today. I did stamp it a third time, but didn't care for the impression as much, so I didn't use that panel. So I have 2 watercolor panels here that I'm just going to set aside to dry. You can also heat set it with a heat tool if you'd like. So as you can see here on that very first impression, you get more crisp lines, and you can always spray that with water if you'd like to get a more loose look on that as well. All right, so I'm going to set those aside to dry, and here we have the bells and bows stamp set. I'm going to stamp 2 of each, so I'm just going to be flipping and rotating my regular white cardstock, and I'm going to stamp with Distress Oxide inks just to keep the same color scheme going. For the bells, I'm using some grays and even introducing a black ink for that last layer. There are 4 layers on the bells. And then for the bow, I'm using the same reds that I used earlier in the poinsettia background stamp, and then introducing a darker color with aged mahogany. Now for these pine stems, I am stamping with Lucky Clover, pine needles, and a little bit of the walnut stain on the branches. When I'm done, I die cut everything, and I just wanted to add a bit of shimmer. There's no Christmas card without a bit of glitter or something. So we are just adding some Ranger glossy accents here that I have in a fine tip applicator. I'm using really small strokes and kind of flicking that glossy accents to replicate the pine needles. And then we'll use some distressed glitter and clear rock candy to add some shimmer and a bit of dimension to those pine needles. Okay, so one more time, I just wanted you to see it better. I'm just flicking out, adding some fine lines of adhesive. You can use any adhesive as long as it dries clear so that you can still see the green on your pine branches. And this will just add some pretty dimension and a bit of glimmer. You can also use flocking if you have some, or even some chunky glitter. That would be really pretty too. Okay, so now our panels are dry. We're going to go ahead and trim down our panels just by 1/4 inch. I'm cutting off 1/8 of an inch off each side. That'll clean up my edges. And then I want to fray them up and give them a bit of a grungy distress look, not with color, but with a little bit of distressing. So Tim Holtz has a paper distressor. I don't have it. I have this other distressor tool, and the Tim Holtz one is on my wish list. And what I like about the Tim Holtz one is it doesn't have such a wide lip. You can see as I'm using this tool that from the edge of this tool to the blade, it's about 1 inch, and the Tim Holtz one is very short, so it's a lot easier to work with, and your fingers don't get in the way like you see here. Okay, so what you do is you take that blade and you just glide it across the edge of your paper. Super easy to do, and you're just gonna go back and forth until it's frayed and distressed the way you like it. It shaves away at the paper, and you can see the debris falling from my cardstock as I'm working. So once you're done, you're going to get this nice distress edging all the way around your panel, and it does kind of raise up your panel a bit, and I think it gives it a lot of interest. I'm going to do this to both panels, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to show one here in the video. Next, I'm going to be working on my sentiments. I've got 2 sentiments here from the Joyful Poinsettia set, and I've stamped them with the walnut stain. Again, I want to keep the same color scheme going, as well as continue with the distressed look. So what I'm going to do after I stamp is also distress these little sentiment panels. After I distress them, I'm also going to use some residual ink from my little finger dauber that I used earlier on the pine cones of that background. And I'm going to flick on that color onto the edging just to give it a little bit of a brown vintage color. And that will just help the sentiment pop a little bit against that busy background. I'm going to play with the layout a little bit before I adhere these sentiments down with some foam adhesive, using my T-ruler, of course, to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. And then we can use our accessory images from the Bells and Bows stamp set that we stamped earlier to spruce up our cards a bit. I always like to play with the layout before I adhere anything down, so once I've laid out my pines and my bows and my bells and decide where I like them, I'm going to flip over those pines and adhere the outer edges first. That way I can hide the pine stems that I don't want to be visible once everything is put together. After attaching those pine stems, I decided I wanted a little bit something more back behind that bow. So I'm going to use a piece of foam tape in the back there, and that kind of raises our images up anyway and makes sure that everything is at the same level. I'm just going to gather some gold thread to give it a bit more interest and color. Again, I'm just going to gather that thread around my fingers, get a good grouping of it, and use that foam adhesive to kind of hold it in place. I'm not really using a pattern or making a bow out of it. I just kind of want it swirling in the background behind the bows and the bell. So I'm going to attach that bell first, and then I'll attach the bow using a bit more foam adhesive as I need it, and then using some liquid adhesive to make sure that the tail of that bow attaches onto those pine sprigs so that everything gets adhered nicely. I'm going to do a similar arrangement with the thread on the second card with a slightly different layout just to give you a couple of ideas on how you can dress up your background panel. And then I'm going to adhere these to card bases. Now before we're done, I'm going to have to add some blings, so I'm going to go ahead and adhere some sequins as well. I'm just going to add some little dots of glue in a few places and then adhere my iridescent sequins to them, and then that will finish our cards for today. I hope you enjoyed being able to make 2 cards or more using this technique. Lots of credit goes to Dawn from W+9 for sharing this technique on her Facebook group so that I can share it with you. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye!